Welcome to Chapter 6, How Computing is Changing Who We Are. This chapter is quite a bit different from the other ones, and there's a lot of material here, so bear with me as we go through this. So it will involve discussing terms like self and self-concept. The objectives we will cover will involve talking about the self. What is the self? What is self-concept? Of course, we're going to focus in on how does computer technology influence the self-concept. What impact will social media and cybernetics have on our future? And by the way, cybernetics deals with some technical advances that are made with prosthesis, which can create different human parts that can be replaced if they're damaged, for example. These all can contribute to compulsions and addictions. There are people that are having elective amputations on otherwise healthy limbs, or at least they desire to have those body parts amputated. So there are about 6 or 7 sections in this chapter, and I think they are somewhat independent. So you'll see rather large jumps in topics from one section to the next in this presentation. So for the first 2 sections of the book, or chapters of the book, as you recall, they all had to do with kind of moral theory, especially in chapter 1. And when we talked about professional codes and what it means to be a professional in chapter 2, chapter 3 through 5 focused more on changes to society. We dealt with privacy and property and safety and critical software. So chapter 6 focuses on the individual, the sense of personal identity, the meaning and significance of interpersonal relationship, the construction of knowledge. There's a debate on whether change is beneficial or detrimental. So we start off in this first section with this case. This case is about a guy who has 2 sons playing video games. The video game in question is something named God of War. In this video game, there is a character named Kratos, who is a Spartan warrior and is on a mission of revenge against the Greek gods. And this particular character displays symptoms of a dissocial personality disorder. In the World Health Organization, or WHO, characterizes this disorder in the following way. This is somebody who has a disregard for social obligation, a callous unconcern for feelings or others, low tolerance of frustration, low thresholds for discharge of aggression or violence, and places blames on others. So you can kind of see, if you're paying attention in the news, that every now and then you'll hear of a story of some individual or a pair of individuals that end up committing, say, acts of violence over things like a parking spot or other trivial things. And so there is some thought that the world has more of this personality disorder than we've had in the past. In any event, Jamal is a father who plays the video games with his 2 sons. And a lot of video games, as you're probably aware, have maybe cartoon violence, or they may have graphic violence. But Jamal is not really bothered by the violence if there's a clear good guy, or if the things that are being done are in self-defense. Now that brings us up to the God of War 3. Jamal is playing the game. He always plays the games before he lets his sons play with them. So Jamal is going through the game, and Kratos rescues a princess. But then he uses his body to open up a metal gate. Apparently there's some type of crank. Kato takes her body, wedges it into the crank, because he needed the crank not to unwind itself. And so with her body, he was able to do that. But during the scene, it was very graphic, and you can hear the bones crunching, and it's pretty disturbing to Jamal. And so some of the questions that we might ask, and I would like to ask all of these questions. We'll take a little bit more, we'll talk more about it here, but we'll talk also about it in more detail online, like our previous chapters. So you need to be prepared to engage in this online session with these questions. So make notes of these and come prepared to talk about them online. So for example, is Jamal more moral than someone who was not disturbed by this scene? Let's say I watched the video and did not find it disturbing like Jamal did. Does that make Jamal more moral than I am? Now, obviously, some of the aspects that are relevant here is that we are talking about a virtual character who's not actually feeling pain. They are not actually dying. And so one of the aspects is just that. Is the virtual immorality somehow transferred into, say, my immorality in real life because I'm not bothered by it? So I'd like to I'd like for you to bring your opinion on this one to our online session for this chapter this week. Obviously, this begs the next question. Is Jamal more moral than somebody who enjoyed the scene? So can you think of this? You can think of this as three levels. I was bothered by the scene. I didn't care about the scene, and I liked the scene. Those are kind of the three options of how you could respond to this. So we know in this case that Jamal was disturbed by the scene. Recall that Aristotle's idea become virtuosus by repeating virtuous acts. Why might Aristotle say that Jamal won't allow his sons to play this game? Can playing this type of video game cause a person to become less moral? So section 2 of the book, you will notice, is very different. This case involves talking about basically online dating relationships that occur online. Now, there are quite a few characters in this story. You will have to read it and perhaps relook at these videos. So we have Mitch and Megan. They are good friends since junior high. Megan is attached to Eric. They are a couple. So this other character, Mitch, meets Eric, and they also participate in a role-playing game. This role-playing game does not involve Megan. And Eric spends a lot of time with Raquel online. So those are kind of some of the things you need to know. Both claim to be each other's sweetheart on Valentine's Day online. So Raquel plays the game too, and in the games they're able to wear a slash declaring their love for each other. Now remember that Eric and Raquel are online, kind of pretending or role-playing a romance. But Eric also has a real romance with Megan. So Mitch, the friend that is involved, thinks that Eric is cheating on Megan with Raquel. And as I said, Eric has the online thing going on with Raquel and a real life thing with Megan. So Mitch confronts Eric, and Eric's response is this: It's only role-playing, so it's not real. I've never physically met her, so can't really be a boyfriend to her. And by the way, Megan doesn't understand this game and might misinterpret this role-playing relationship, so don't tell her. So obviously we have a series of questions around this case that I'd like for you to think over and be prepared to address online. Was Mitch right to confront Eric and question him about Raquel? Is it possible to cheat on a boyfriend or a girlfriend with someone you have never met face to face? Identify some behavior that does not occur face to face that would be evidence that a person was being unfaithful to his or her significant other. How would you answer differ if there was a face-to-face game? Okay. Section 3 is, I think, one of the longest sections in this chapter, and it has to do with how the internet affects the concept of self. And so the definition of self, a relatively stable set of perceptions of who we are to ourselves and others and to our social systems. So my perception of self might involve, I believe I'm a hard worker. I believe that I'm competent. I believe I'm fair and loyal. There are other things of how I view myself, but for now, I think this is enough to go on. So self-concept is just that. It's the ideas and feelings that I have about myself. Now, there is a YouTube video included here that you need to watch. It's only about 2 minutes, so it shouldn't take long. This is not meant to be an authoritative video. Rather, it's meant to be somewhat entertaining, and while presenting some things without, say, an authority or expert. Oops. Sorry. Okay, the internet and the self. So continuing along this line, how does image manipulation impact self conception? So it is probably no secret that magazines, online advertising, when they take photos of things, people's models, they regularly and routinely manipulate those images. And because that is done so often, it has started to impact, say, young girls, and even more recently, the trend is affecting boys and men as well about how they feel about themselves. So it is worth noting that it is common to airbrush photographs to remove wrinkles or spots, and this was done even long ago, before the digital age. So I actually remember a magazine, golly, probably a decade ago or more, that had Oprah on the front page, and it was clear that it was Oprah's face, but it was clear that it was not Oprah's body. They had replaced it with somebody else's torso, and it created a lot of interesting conversation at the time of how deceitful it was of the publisher and for Oprah for agreeing to this airbrush incident. So basically, the doctoring of digital images is not necessarily a recent thing. So some examples of this are shown here, and one is a Newsweek article in 2005 where Martha Stewart was made to look thinner than she actually was. So Martha Stewart, probably to many of you, may not have even heard of her name, but she had a TV show and a magazine talking about homemaking and crafts and how to be good hosts and that kind of thing. And just kind of as an aside, she also went to jail for insider trading, but that doesn't really apply here. Just an interesting tidbit. So they edited images to make her look thin, kind of similar to the Oprah example I just talked about. Another example is a periodical in France. They removed the love handles of the French president, Nicolas Sarkozy. I think in this picture, and you have the links here, so go and look for yourselves. I think he was at a beach and his shirt was off, and they made him look more fit than his body actually was. And then lastly, I think this is actually very entertaining and enlightening and maybe even shocking. Some of you may have seen these before, but have another look. It's only about 1 minute long, and in this 1 minute video, they take a woman and they put her into a modeling pose. And after that, they start doing digital manipulations, and it is enlightening, to say the least. Okay, so National Organization for Women, which is known for NOW, and other psychologists, they're becoming very concerned with this type of activity. They're concerned that it will lead healthy people to believe they are overweight or unattractive, which may contribute to more eating disorders, and people wanting to have elective cosmetic surgery to improve themselves. So let me just say, women, girls, and as I mentioned just briefly before, boys and men are quickly becoming impacted by this as well. And so see these standards of beauty. They see these as standards of beauty, and then they try to emulate it. So Ralph Lauren was had a blue label clothing line, and in this scenario, models shown in the ads were actually skinnier than what they were in real life. And people noticed this and posted and mocked the photos online. And Ralph Lauren tried to block the criticism by filing a DMCA infringement, which would have had to do with Ralph Lauren's clothing line because of this type of infringement. So it didn't really work because it wasn't a infringement on the clothing line. It was One internet provider for one of the journalists said it was fair use and did not take the pictures off the site. So this first link in this slide is a link to where you can see many other professional people who have been suspect to these types of digital image manipulations, and it's definitely worth a look. So the French were considering implementing a law that would require putting warnings when photos were retouched to modify the physical appearance. There is a recent development that is here in this link that is from March of 2015, and still at this point the law has not been implemented, but it appears like it was leading towards being passed. So in 2011, Britain banned 2 cosmetic ads because of misleading content. The case actually involved Julia Roberts and Christy Turlington. I'm not sure I know who that person is. So thinking it through. So we'll talk about some of the questions around these examples we just reviewed. Which of the 3 is most ethically troubling and why? And then consider the proposed French law and be prepared to discuss why you think it would be a good law, a bad law, and whether or not the U.S. should enact a similar law. We'll talk about that in our online session. So continuing on to a slightly different topic, we need to consider online personas and the impact those have on one's self-conception. We have 3 personas here that we are going to look at. Bill on Facebook. He's a professional in his 40s. We have a different handle on a carspace.com guy who likes cars with performance specs, and he's more likely to buy those types of cars. And lastly, we have a myspace.com, which still exists today, but not many people use it anymore. So he has a handle called Necrotic1, and he is a heavy metal fan and likes branded clothing and jewelry, and is inclined to buy things that make him feel unique. So the interesting piece to understand here is that multiple online personas allows a person to maintain multiple mutually incompatible value systems through the use of these online personas. And by the way, all of these 3 personas we just looked at are the same guy. So he's got 3 different personas, 3 different value systems. So here's an article that talks about different people and their behavior online versus offline. And for some people, there obviously can be wild swings between these personas and the authentic self. So when I started reading this and thinking through some of these things, I came across this question that says, how many of you have multiple online personas? And I want you to contemplate that and be open and honest about it. For me, that's pretty easy. I don't have any. Now, I probably have at least a couple in the real world. Professor, sister, daughter, mother. I think you get the picture. I don't necessarily act and provide the same information in all of these real-life personas. So moving on, Chris Gonsalves, an editor and author for Business Tech magazine, says it is counterproductive to think of people as having true selves or true personas to explain all of their actions or dislikes. So going back to my example, things I might do or say at home might not be things I would say or do as my role as a professor, and vice versa. So another analyst from a tech company says that businesses should be selling to personas, not the person. A persona will show you how it wants to be treated, which I think is very an interesting concept. So if we go back to the example of the car performance spec guy, this analyst would say that that the car performance site should try to advertise to sell to his persona, which would be, putting gadgets and stuff on cars. Obviously, the context determines how a person acts and their likes and dislikes. So going back to my example again, how I behave in the classroom is obviously going to be different than how I am at home. And the textbook talks about the classic work-life balance in the 1980s and 90s. It was very big back then. People generally at that point in time had two personas, their work life and their home one. However, now in the virtual age, there may be people that have dozens of persona, multiple Facebook and Twitter accounts. So this was stated earlier that multiple online personas allows a person to maintain multiple incompatible value systems. And one example, which is a real-life example, would be, say, a basketball player. So in the game of professional basketball, sometimes things get heated, and sometimes you will see punches being thrown between two people. It has occurred where people that were punching and fighting each other actually might have been friends. And so the fight occurred in the game, but the fight would never have occurred at a picnic if these two people were at outside of basketball and just at a picnic. So you can see that the two have a game persona and an after game persona. And there is some beliefs that multiple personas is a harmful thing. And one thought is, why should you act any different in one context or another? There are these self-help type individuals like Dr. Phil or Oprah who talk about something maybe called the authentic self. They kind of view that the proper way to approach things is to be consistent regardless of the context. It might be suggested that a multiple persona person might be a hypocrite, which in this case means that a person might follow a particular moral code in one context but act differently in another. And therefore, as a result of these conflicting personas, would be considered a hypocrite. So I thought about this hard and long, and for myself, as I mentioned already, I feel as if I have several different personas, but I don't feel as if it means I'm a hypocrite per se. I think it could mean that if any of my different personas really conflicted morally with how I act in my other personas. So for example, I typically do not impose my religious beliefs on students, whereas I do in my personal family life. And just because I don't take a religious stand in front of my student doesn't mean I'm being a hypocrite when I do this with my family. So in other words, some contexts are not made to receive the same level of content. Okay, so thinking through. So this, I'd like for you to go through this and be prepared to discuss in our online session this week. Do you think that having multiple with conflicting systems of values, do you find that inherently immoral? And reflect back on Chapter 2, when we talked about professional ethics, and explain why it might be necessary for a person to have multiple persona with conflicting systems of values in order to do certain jobs. I will look forward to that. That will be an interesting conversation. So now we turn our attention to the internet and how that impacts sociopathic tendencies. Obviously, in social networks like Facebook, Instagram, or other online video games, these things can be used as a tool to harm others. And the term cyberbullying comes to mind for people who use computer technology to do this type of thing. And one question that people typically ask, or sometimes you will hear, is, well, that's just bullying, like just back in the old days. But you might ask, is it causing bullying to expand? So in other words, is it more common because of the internet technology we have access to today? And certainly seems like it is, and the sociopaths that might be perpetrating this type of thing suffer from a dissocial personality disorder. I think we talked about that earlier. So I think many people would agree that the internet does make it easier for this type of activity to occur more often than without the use of the internet. This video that is included here is about 20 minutes long, and it involves a woman named Monica Lewinsky. You may or may not have heard her name, but she was a person. I think she was an intern working at the White House back when President Clinton was president, so back in '98. And basically, the story is that she had inappropriate relations, or he had it with her, vice versa, and it was a big scandal. And when that happened, she was a huge target by many people online and was being harassed. And as a result of that, and the impact of that really has caused her to take this new role in fighting against cyberbullying. So there is one type of sociopath that is referred to as a griefer. This is a term that has been used for a couple of decades now. And what these people are individuals that want others to have a bad time when they are playing their games. That is their main point in getting on the games, and that is to make others who are having fun not have fun or spoil their fun. So there was a Julian Dibble article in 2008 in the Wired magazine that talks about the organization of this type of individual. It is no longer isolated individuals. They are now organized and getting grounded in online messaging boards. So these griefers come together, and when griefers come together, they build their mantra and gather more grievers to help expand their mission. So obviously the internet provides the opportunity for these people to meet each other, especially in a way that we couldn't have done prior to this, because now you don't even have to worry about any kind of geographical boundaries to get you all together, because you can come together online. So here's an example of a griever. If you remember the EVE Online role-playing game that we spoke about in Chapter 4, there's a virtual article in there called a Titan spaceship. It cost about $10,000 real dollars to build one. And so an individual with that kind of money existed, and this person was able to build one of these vehicles. But along came a group of griefers. The griefers in this case called themselves the Goon Fleet, and their sole purpose was to find and destroy this guy's Titan spaceship. One of the griefers, you can see some of the quotes that are coming out of them here. You know, his one of the comments is, the ability to inflict the huge amount of actual real-life damage on someone is amazingly satisfying. Kind of scary. Their explanation of why this was so important to them had to do with making everyone else miserable on this game, so that they wouldn't come back to what they felt was a miserable game. So obviously it wasn't just causing harm to an individual who was playing the game. It was really to, in this case, kind of boycott EVE, the online game. So obviously grievers drive away customers, as can be seen in this scenario. It almost appears that this was more of their major goal, which comes in higher than ruining it for other people. Again, that didn't come out very well, but the purpose was they wanted to take the company down. So as a result of this, companies don't like griefers and have taken to supplying online guides that provide suggestions on how a consumer on a particular site could deal with griefers. Online game company Linden Labs developed a friendly greeters to help welcome new customers, so that anytime a new person showed up, they were greeted with a friendly person who could show them around and kind of the ropes and help them make their first experience enjoyable, and then also to kind of help them be aware of griefers in these online games and maybe how to handle them. So the next type of sociopath is referred to as a troll. A troll is someone who posts in a public forum or chat room with the main goal of subverting conversations or provoking an emotional response. A couple of examples, maybe someone posts a question about how to do something and a troll answers with bad or damaging information. That might be an example. So you can go online to nearly any online forum and you will see that no matter what happens, there is somebody that is blaming the president. And that would be kind of a person called a troll. Then this case, a lot of raging among both sides of this post that is likely not even real to begin with. So I've included a 3-minute video that you might find interesting about the brains of internet trolls. It's not created by a troll, it's created by an individual who's trying to understand the mind of an internet troll. So I'd like for you to watch that. And so we have the cyber bully or cyber stalker term, and essentially they are using computer technology, in particular the internet, to harass a particular target. They generally do this anonymously, but choose real-life targets. And unlike griefers or trolls, these people are known to the cyberbully, but not vice versa, because of the anonymity of the cyberbully takes on. Griefers and trolls select random or ideologically motivated targets. So there's not a specific person they're trying to make miserable. And I think it's pretty safe to say, without much argument, that the internet simply makes it much easier for cyberbullies to invade another person's privacy. So, for example, I'll explain that further. You know, when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, yes, that makes me old. If there was a bully, and somebody was bullying someone at school, at least there was respite from that when the victim would go home. You know, we didn't have mechanisms to allow this to go on, whereas today, cyberbullies have a 24/7 access to bully a target. I would, it's not on here, but I have it in my notes. I'd like for you to consider griefing and whether it's inherently wrong. And in doing this, I would like for you to tie that to an ethical theory that we discussed in Chapter 1. And I apologize that it's not here, but see if we can do that. Okay. So what we have here is, this is an antisocial personality disorder. And basically, as you can tell, it's a list of 7 criteria that define what an antisocial personality disorder is. And by the way, this comes from the Diagnostic and Statistic Mental Book of Mental Disorders. And I believe it's from version 4. But this manual has been around for a long time and has gone through several revisions as updates to things have to be made. And professionals in the mental health field use this to help diagnose and treat patients with disorders. So generally, if somebody has 3 or more of the 7 criteria or characteristics, they would be thought to have this disorder. So failure, I'm not going to read all of them, I'm going to let you do that, but so failure to conform to social norms, deceitfulness, impulsivity, irritability, recklessness, disregard for safety of self or others, or consistent irresponsibility or lack of remorse. So if a person possessed 3 or more of these, they would be considered as having this antisocial personality disorder. So going back to the cyberbullying versus regular bullying for a minute, the NIH, which is the National Institute of Health, in 2010 they did a study that identified links between bullying and depression. So here we're going to see that there is actually a difference between the two. There are some commonalities between a a real-life bully and a cyber bully. But there are differences between these forms as well. So in a physical bully, a face-to-face schoolyard type bully, the physical bullies are more likely to be depressed than their victims. But the exact opposite is true in cyberbullying. The theory or explanation for this cyberbullying is that the victims tend to feel isolated because of their harasser's ability to, one, appear anonymous, and two, have this unlimited access to bullying because of the internet. So this causes feelings of helplessness and isolation, which causes a person to feel dehumanized. So now we turn our focus to the concept of normalization. Obviously, computers have changed our perception of what is normal. Normalization is a way to view certain things as being normal these days. So for example, I'll take one example from all of the ad images that were involving super skinny models. People tend to think that it's normal to be this thin, and that is what women and men should look like. So people start to view this as the state of what is normal. And the prevalence of online grieving and harassment is causing some people to start to think and view that this behavior is normal. I mean, remember back to the one comment that somebody said is, oh yeah, this is just like bullying in the old days. Well, it actually isn't. So because it occurs so much and so frequent, it's difficult to stop these things. Some people just say that it's just that way, and that's the way it's going to be these days, and let's not do anything about it. So thinking it through, for our online session this week, I want you to consider this question of, is grieving morally wrong? Ah, there it is. Be prepared to cite any moral theories to back up your opinion. I'm glad that I had it there. Makes me feel like at least you'll have something to go back and make sure you capture. So do you think that internet forums, social networks, etc., are causing people to develop sociopathic tendencies when they might not have otherwise? So two things happening here I want you to pay attention to and be prepared to talk about. Okay, so now we turn our focus to addictions and the compulsions and the issues that computing and technology place on these terms or notions. A behavioral addiction is an addiction to certain online behaviors like gambling, video games, internet surfing, sex, porn, etc. And until recently, only substance abuse was recognized as an addiction, so alcohol, crack, cocaine, heroin. But research now shows that online gamblers, for example, are experiencing symptoms similar to alcoholism or nicotine addiction. And the new DSM, which is that Diagnostic and Statistic Manual for Mental Health Issues, it's going to likely be updated here to include gambling as an addiction, taking it from where it once was identified as just an impulse control issue. So a gambling disorder has several criteria needed to be classified as a disorder. And here they are. They needs to gamble with increasing amounts of money in order to achieve desired excitement, gets restless or irritable when attempting to cut down or stop gambling, and has made repeated unsuccessful efforts to control, cut back, or stop the gambling. You need to gamble, these will come up again in just a minute with a slight variation, so you need to make sure you understand these three. So this brings us to this question: can video gaming become an addiction? So the idea is we had some diagnostic criteria for what the DSM says is a person with a gambling disorder. that we can use for assessing whether or not a person has an online video gaming addiction. So again, remember the three criteria. What you can do is take out the word gamble and put video game. Needs to play video games with increasing amounts of money. Is restless or irritable when attempting to cut down or stop playing video games, and has made several unsuccessful attempts to control, cut back, or stop playing video games. So that's the notion here of how to kind of diagnose whether or not video gaming can be an addiction. One of the things about online addiction is that it is done in private often. This reduces fears of being caught, which is a major deterrent in I guess a more physical, normal addiction like alcoholism. It's hard to hide that. But these kind of addictions are easier to hide because you can do them in private. So the convenience of the internet makes it easy to feed these addictions. You can play anytime, anywhere. So here are a couple of articles. The first article talks about the inconclusiveness of internet addiction as a mental disorder. And so the term mental disorder has not quite been solidified and equated to internet addiction. But the article talks about assigning blame about whether or not it is the screen time spent or something else that causes a person to have a problem. So I'd really like for you to read that article. And if we have time, we will probably try and discuss this one. So some examples of online addiction are the Pop Games survey that was done in 2007 by Jonathan Karl for ABC News. And in this first example, we have a survey that nearly a quarter of white-collar workers were surveyed, who played video games at work. And the results were actually kind of frightening. For top executive, 35%, which is well over a third, admitted to playing games at work. Many people said they play on lunch breaks or other breaks throughout their day, but 14% of that 35 admitted to playing during conference calls or meetings. So 84% average between 15 to 60 minutes per day during the workday. So the example concerning ABC's News, they had an investigation that showed that the SEC, which is the Security Exchange Commission, those are the people that deal with our stocks and what have you, the top managers spent a significant amount of time each day visiting pornographic websites. Okay, so compulsion versus addiction. So here we come to a couple of terms, compulsion versus addiction. We start off with an article that talks about it, and it's written by somebody from Columbia University, a professor from Columbia University. And the term compulsion generally involves some repetitive, ritualistic behavior that might not have a rational reason. So, for example, somebody, whenever they go to their car, may count their steps. There's no rational reason as to why they're counting their steps, but they need to count them, and that person themselves might get some relief from this. It may help reduce anxiety. So addictions, and I will have to be frank, that the differences between these two seem to be very slight, and actually addictions seem pretty similar to compulsions. But the difference, I believe, is that the person has the inability to stop the harmful behavior. That's how I determine this separation. So somebody who has a compulsion, they're more likely to be able to, one, not do something that is really harmful, where addictions like gambling or substance abuse, those are very, very harmful and have huge consequences, and in many cases, many people can't stop. So that's how I think of it as the differences. So we have another thinking it through for you to contemplate for our online session this week on this chapter. Psychologists treat compulsive behaviors differently from addictive behaviors. Could checking Facebook or Twitter updates be considered an addiction or a compulsion? I'd like you to be prepared to provide your stance and also support your stance. Okay, so this section, which is section 6.4 from the textbook, talks about social networks in life and in graphs. And the term graph is important, and we're going to focus in on that a little bit. This is kind of interesting from a computer science perspective because while this particular class is mostly humanities based within the context of computing, the concept of graph is very central to computer science. So this next section is it's a semi-technical thing, and I'll try and take it slow enough so that everyone will be able to capture it. So we have a social network, let's just say Facebook. And on Facebook we have friends, and people have different friends in their groups. And the graph is going to be a visual representation of these organizations. It's going to show a one-to-one relationship between them, as we will see. So here I'm going to take a little peek down here. You can see this in the lower right-hand corner. We have a graph and we have individuals in these bubbles. So for example, a line might mean that that two people are friends with one another. So in this case, you can see that Anne is friends with Ed because there's a line between them. These graphs can be useful for understanding how things are organized in society. So the term graph theory, and in fact there are entire courses and textbooks written on graph theory and how to analyze these things as a branch of mathematics that is used to analyze these types of social networks. So what's graph theory and what do all of these things mean? So what we have is nodes, which again are these bubbles. These guys are considered nodes. So Anne, Don, Bob, Ed, and Kate. These are all considered nodes. We have edges, which are the 7 arcs between the nodes. And we have paths, which are the sequence of edges that lead from one node to another. So we see here a couple of paths between Bob, Ann, Don, and Kate, and one path between Bob, Don, and Kate. So we've got Bob, Ann, Don, and Kate. That's one path. And then there's Bob, Don, and Kate is another path. And path length is the number of edges in a path. So in this case, there are 3 paths. And in this case, there are 2. And the shortest path between 2 particular nodes is the path with the least number of edges. I think that makes sense. So there's an idea that came out of graph theory, and it is referred to as the 6 degrees of separation. Basically, that means that everyone in the world was separated by 6 degrees from one another. So the concept is this: I have friends, those friends have friends, and those friends have friends, and so on. And if you look at all those and do this 6 times, basically everyone in the world would be in that group of individuals. So to test this, there was an individual named Stanley Milgram that sent U.S. mail letters to test this hypothesis. And the idea was that the letters were supposed to be targeted to Milgram's friends. It was supposed to be targeted to a Milgram's friend in Boston. So there's an individual in Boston. That's the end target. So eventually what he was trying to do is he was trying to get a letter to that person in Boston. So Milgram sent letters randomly to individuals in Wichita. And in the letter, it said a few things. It said, if you know this individual from Boston, send a letter to him. Otherwise, if you don't know that person, send a letter to a person you think knows a friend that knows him. And generally took 6.5 cycles on average for his friend in Boston to get a letter. And he did get it. So you can see that this particular experiment came pretty close to the 6 degrees of separation theory that we're talking about here. Oops. So how does this fit with social networks in life and in graphs? Social networks, we are talking about things like Facebook and or LinkedIn and so on. These sites, as I'm certain you're aware, you can post information, images, you can make comments, you can leave messages, you can like. And when you're liking something in as it relates to graphs, a node is actually created, and an edge between you and that node is created. So this term called social network analysis, which is actually a thriving research field these days, started to look at these. And these techniques that are in social network analysis are used by marketers and scholars, who are interested in maybe studying trends in our society. So maybe they want to try and predict the outcome on elections. So they might look at tweets or Twitters to see if they can see any kind of connection between the nodes on a site to come up with analysis to determine how they think the election is going to turn out. So we have another thinking it through. The government actually uses this NSA notion. And so the question would be, why would they do this? Well, it turns out, for example, terrorists often use social networks as a means to communicate with one another. And because they are online, organizations like DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, which is part of the military and our government here in the US, has explored using NSA to identify potential terrorist activity. So needless to say, these agencies go to Facebook and others to provide them with social network graphs of all their users. And the thing is, they want the network, the graph, and they want all of the users. So the problem, obviously, is Facebook consists of hundreds of millions of users, first of all, and they may only need a fraction of those users to find terrorist activity, but they want it all, and they want the user information. So, should social networking companies comply with these requests voluntarily, or should they wait until the court order? I think you probably would remember the San Bernardino incident, gosh, maybe even just a year or so ago. The government wanted Apple to open this guy's phone to be able to have access to it and possibly links to other terrorists. And it was a big, big thing. So think about that, and if you want, look up that case. So what are privacy implications of releasing the network structure to the police department, even if identities are not released? I want you to contemplate that as you think about this and the impact. Okay. So we are moving into section 6.5, and you can see each section seems to be a major shift in topic here. I mentioned that at the beginning. This topic is how do we know what we are being presented is actually truthful? And this is huge right now. You hear an awful lot about fake news, and just from my personal perspective, I think this context of talking about fake news only helps to make everything suspect, and I think that's the point. So this stuff is really important that we're going to be talking about. So epistemology is a study of knowledge and how we know what we know. So how do we determine what is true or not? The textbook stresses reasons as a primary way of constructing knowledge. So in other words, direct observations, the use of experts. Knowledge can be acquired directly or indirectly. And so directly, you construct the knowledge from observations and or reasoning. And indirectly, you're given the knowledge by others through language. So how much do we trust indirectly acquired knowledge? There's a growing role of intentional biases in internet searching and advertising. So that should have some bearing on whether or not you trust indirect acquired information. Okay, so the term homophily is a tendency for people to be close to people similar to themselves. And Facebook uses homophily to their advantage. It enables them to increase the effectiveness of online advertising. So the like button can be used on web pages of companies, and liking allows Facebook to learn about your friends' attitudes and preferences. So there's this instant personalization present in the ads and content that comes out of this, that they are able to then develop and send, and you know, I oftentimes feel pounded by these things. But that's how this is all happening. So Bing searches, both web pages and users is connected to Facebook friends as well. So the whole point here is all of these things are becoming connected to Facebook. And if you haven't seen this trend, I'm thinking you're either not online very much, which I know isn't the case, or not really thinking about all of these connections and the implications. So Belko.com acquired IBM in early 2015. So if you try to search it, you're going to get a link back to IBM. Essentially what it was is a search engine that presented results based upon a point of view. So as an example, if you wanted to search for healthcare and you wanted a liberal perspective or a conservative perspective, you could focus and customize your search based upon that through, say, some keywords or tags. Not sure why you'd want to do that, but I would think if you were trying to form a real perspective, you would look at both sides. Anyway, so in terms of what we would like to talk about online, I would like for you to think about these questions. When searching for information about political issues on the internet, would you prefer that the pages be sorted by quality only, or you would like your beliefs taken into account so that the high quality of pages that agree with you are shown closer to the top than the high quality pages that you don't agree with? So it kind of links back to that thing we were just talking about. Would you prefer to see online advertisements that are randomly selected, or would you prefer to see advertisement for things that you and your friends like? Okay, think about that and we'll talk about it. So we're talking about how we know something. This is an important topic because it uses and discusses concepts, say, such as Wikipedia or articles that are on the web and how reliable they are. And obviously these days, a lot of students, and myself included, use Wikipedia. We should talk about what that exactly means and how reliable that really is, and we'll do that in a few minutes. So this is what this section is about. First of all, is it important to be an expert in a topic? So if you were to consider your academic work, in other words, the assignments and that you turn in, do you consider the quality of information that you use before you do so? So, for example, if you wrote an essay on U.S. history, would you trust a Wikipedia article on U.S. history if the author is a history professor or an average person? Okay, I want you to think about that and be prepared to explain that. Personally, I think it may depend on the topic, but in this case, we are talking about U.S. history. So for example, on U.S. history, I would trust a professor's article on Wikipedia above an average user. But if it were a topic that was not written about a lot, especially in scholarly work, I might be more open to trusting just an average person who may have taken time to write about the experience and things that they know. So for me personally, when I have to do an extensive research for a project, I typically don't go to Wikipedia and use it as a reliable source. And as a rule of thumb for students, it may be a source that you use, but it should not be the last or only search you use when writing academic pieces. So that's a little note here that's worth you considering. So the reason for all of this is that Wikipedia, if you don't know this, can be edited by anyone. And so there is really no significant editorial control, which means it's probably hard to trust. I think that was certainly a big thing when it started. And still, that reputation kind of is still there today. So people can edit those pages with anything they want to, whether it's right or wrong. This whole idea behind Wikipedia is really known as crowdsourcing. And crowdsourcing is doing a task by letting the public do it. But because it can be edited by anyone, there are problems. So here are a list of problems from your textbook. And a composer, Maurice, somebody added a fake quote to the Wikipedia page. I believe it's on here. Yeah, this first one. So this is an interesting concept. This guy goes in and adds this fake quote to this Wikipedia page, which is, again, this happens. This does really happen, and this is why, as a student and a professional, you absolutely need to validate your sources and information. What ended up happening was that same quote, somebody else must have gone to Wikipedia, because a journalist took that same quote, and he was a journalist for the Guardian newspaper, and he wrote it in an article. And boy, as a journalist, that's like the last thing you want to do is publish an article that is incorrect. Anybody should be concerned about that. Okay, speaking of sources, something as referred to as a primary source would be something as close as possible to the topic being studied. So, for example, if you were studying Ben Franklin, you should go directly to his letters that still exist from history as a primary source. A secondary source would be something that discusses information that's presented elsewhere. So, for example, an authoritative history of the Revolutionary War would be considered a second source. And a tertiary source is a survey of summary of other works, and this is where you might find articles on Wikipedia. So now that we have discussed these issues around Wikipedia and primary, secondary, and tertiary sources, I'd like for you to answer these questions for our online session. If you notice a significant error in a Wikipedia article, do you have a moral duty to correct it? Remember, this is a crowdsourcing thing, so anybody can do it. And if you're a scholar or an expert and you notice a significant error in Wikipedia in your area of expertise, do you have a professional duty to correct it. And then finally, what if you're on a lesser known site that's not used for this kind of stuff and you do this? Do you have a duty to try and get that information corrected? So now we turn our focus to cyber dating. And if you remember, we talked about this term, the authentic self. And one can strive to be the authentic self or say that there is no such thing as authentic self. And interactions are context dependent. And one view of dating is to get to know your partner's authentic self. Obviously, this is a big concern when trying to find a partner or a mate. And Match.com did a survey of 7,000 couples, and 70% of the marriages in the last 3 years started through meeting online. So clearly, this trend is taking off, which will only probably continue, I would imagine. So thinking it through, what do you want to know about a person you are considering for a long-term relationship? And is it possible or reasonable for people to fall in love if they've never met face to face? Many people seem to have negative opinions of meeting people or dating or falling in love online. What do you think about this? So now we turn our attention to diverse perspectives, and in particular race in video games. The book discusses an example of this through examining the video game Grand Theft Auto. And in this story, there's a man named CJ who happens to be an African American protagonist. It is highly scripted. He completes his mission and is rewarded with a cutscene that advances him to the next plot. So a New York Times author criticizes the game for playing on racial stereotypes. There are a fair number of videos on YouTube that show the playing of this game, if you're not familiar. So I would like for you to look at some of those videos and decide for yourself whether it plays on racial stereotypes or not. So back to the article. In this article, the author views it as a modern form of a minstrel show. And the term minstrel show generally originated in the 19th century and was referred to as U.S. entertainments performed by white people in blackface. So it depicted African Americans as lazy and ignorant and etc. So digital minstrelsy, that's hard to say, minstrelsy, is the role-playing meeting following this criteria. It's primarily played out on a computer or a gaming console. A person who is a member of an advantaged group in real life plays the role of a person from a disadvantaged group. And purposefully, it's demeaning members of the disadvantaged group. So does this main character in the Grand Theft Auto scenario really meet these criteria? I'd like for you to really look at that, and if not, identify which of the criteria are not met in this case, okay? Now our focus changes to interdisciplinary topic, which is understanding media. Media is extensions of humanity. Media extends some natural human process and can be used interchangeably with the word technology. So new media that was not used extensively 30 years ago, of course, is the internet, Twitter, Facebook, email, Google, video games, and apps, and so on. So a scholar named Marshall McCullen authored several books called Understanding Media. The extension of a man and medium is the message. These were written in the 60s, and you can see that in each of these, we're talking about media or medium. And he foresaw many of the societal changes now taking place. And here's a quote from one of his books. Societies have always been shaped more by the nature of the media by which men communicate than by the content of the communication. So, for example, let me just use Facebook. Facebook is a medium, and how people communicate and what that provides people is far greater than the pictures on there or somebody's ham sandwich. So, in essence, the concept here is just that media does really shape us and our society and our ethics. So the summary of McCullen's says that the media are basically extensions of humanity. The medium is the message. The contents are always less important than the medium itself. Media are often overlooked because people are focused on the contents and not the medium. So for example, let's take the electric light bulb. The electric light bulb is the medium that shapes and controls the scale and form of human association and action. Think about brain surgery in the light or baseball under the lights. You know, without these things would be very different. We wouldn't be able to play baseball at night. Brain surgery without lights, not probably a good idea. So McLuhan, developed a concept called tetrad. And tetrad has 4 questions to help analyze a new medium and foresee its effects. And here they are. What does the artifact enhance? Was it obsolesced? Were earlier actions, services brought back into play? So in other words, did it bring something back? And what will be eventually original characteristic that will be reversed? And so then we give you an example here, which is a washing machine tetrad. If you consider this to the olden days, which I know would be well beyond anything you guys would have seen, but I remember my mom and my grandmother using a basin and a board to wash clothes. So certainly this medium enhances the speed of doing laundry, and it does make the scrub board in the tub obsolete. And it retrieves this notion of the antiseptic house, which, because it just it gives us the ability to use cleansers and use hot water and make things very clean. And it reverses into a continuous laundry ability. So be able to do laundry all the time. So can you apply this concept of tetrad to Twitter? Think about that. So finally, our last topic for this chapter has to do with cybernetic future. And cybernetic technology has to do with grafting through either computers or machines, grafting parts into and onto living organisms. Cybernetics is the study of self-regulating, self-controlling systems. And the term cyborg or cybernetic organisms are living organisms that have computer or machine parts that are attached to them. The augmentation basically we are talking about are computerized prostheses that provide abilities that normal human beings don't have. So, you know, perhaps you'd like to have super keen eyesight or have an extremely strong arm, that kind of type of thing. So here's some examples that are used in the textbook, and this one is about Oscar Pistorius, who's a sprinter from South Africa. He was born without lower legs, and he used carbon fiber prosthetic legs and was a runner. And he competed and was highly decorated in events that were held for people with prosthetics. But he wanted to compete with able-bodied people, so he petitioned the IAAF World Championship to be able to do this. And the IAAF finally ruled that he could compete after much controversy, I want to be clear about. So, and he went on to help his team win the silver medal in the 4x400 meter relay. So as an aside, I don't know why I put this tidbit in here, but this guy also had to do some jail time here recently for the death of his girlfriend. Kind of an interesting story. Don't think that they found him completely guilty, but they found him guilty enough to make him do time. So there was a lot of controversy, as I mentioned, over this because, you know, the prosthetics that Oscar used in these games, they were considered to have an unfair advantage over able-bodied runners because they were like blades with springs in them, and that was seen to other able-bodied runners as having an advantage. So as it was, the legs were examined by professionals who deemed them, I don't know how they did this, but they deemed them as not providing an unfair advantage over able-bodied runners. However, the bigger issue here is as we go forward into the future, it is hard to predict that these bionic legs may be actually may be more powerful and more faster than and stronger than able-bodied legs. So there is definitely going to have to be a point at which these legs have to be regulated in terms of competing with able-bodied athletes. So here are two proposals. Proposal 1, and again, this is for bionic legs, says that bionic legs should be set to perform at the medium level of performance exhibited by able-bodied athletes. And the second proposal says that bionic legs should be set to perform at the median level of performance exhibited by able-bodied athletes in their previous year's competition. So you see, this is just really the complexity of the technology and the complexity of the issues it creates is overwhelming sometimes. So, elective surgery is surgery that is not medically necessary but is desired by the patient. Case 1 here, we're going to look at a couple of cases. Case 1 looks at a patient with a non-functional hand that was injured in an accident. His hand looked fine, but had some nerve damage. And the patient wanted it amputated to get a bionic hand. So case 2 has to do with a person who has what is known as a body integrity identity disorder, a BIID. And that is people with this disorder feel as if their bodies do not match their self-images. So the person wanted to have a limb amputated to match his self-image of himself. Evidently, he thought he shouldn't have an arm, and so he wanted it amputated. And then the third case involves someone who just wanted to replace a healthy limb with a better bionic limb. So what I'd like for you to think about, I would like you to think about all three of these cases and be ready to discuss how you feel about each of these elective surgery options and whether or not they are ethically and morally permissible. So that brings us to the end of this chapter and this lecture. And as a reminder, there are many Thinking It Through slides and other places throughout this lecture where I asked you to prepare for our online discussions. And I look forward to that engagement this week. Thanks.